Welcome to another edition of FSUFO, also known as Forbidden Science. Today we're doing something a little different. There is no guest. Today we're doing the first of what's going to be known as a deep dive special. And today's topic is the UFO case from hell, or my personal name for what some people call the Shelburne story. Nothing's off limits. I've invited my co host, Justin Brown, to dig deep and to come at me, ask whatever he wants, and demand an answer. Could get a little messy as he picks my brains. Sit down for the next hour. I hope you get to enjoy it. I can only hope he doesn't have too much fun making sport of me, whatever, because I feel when it comes to this case, I have some splaining to do. Let's go.
Yeah, I'm excited, Chris. This is a story that I've been waiting to talk to you about for a really long time. I know you're chomping at the bit to talk about this, and you don't want me to piss you off, but I'm gonna. Who cares about anything other than Shag Harbour? What's the deal with CFS Shelburne? I know the little bit of connection that, and I don't want to do a spoiler alert, but there is so much going on here that in a lot of ways it puts the Shag Harbour story to shame. Should I even hint at what we're going to be getting at here? Because people want to know. Like, there's some big stories in this one.
Yeah, well, let me give you my take on it here, sort of thing. That's just what I kind of don't want to hear from the public, from people. But it's been brewing for a long time. My great fear here is that yes, there's this great case called Shag Harbor that's kind of beyond reproach. And my hope has always been from the beginning is that the myth does not overtake the case. That's certainly happened with Roswell and other UFO crash scenarios. But first of all, I resist the idea that necessarily, and it came naturally. That's how it was first presented to me that the Shelburne story is intrinsically bound to the Shag Harbor incident. Um, I can't say it isn't, but I'm going to present, hopefully, my answers to you today, the evidence for both sides of that argument. But I'll tell you one thing about the case: I hate it. Shag Harbor for me over the years obviously has been, I've often called it jokingly, because I don't mean this monetarily, the gift that keeps on giving. Every time something new has been learned over the years as a result of my research efforts and the efforts of others, it has only served to strengthen the case and to make Shag Harbor one of the strongest arguments. Listen, one of our recent guests, podcaster Martin Willis, said it's perhaps the most compelling argument for UFO reality, and I would agree. The Shelburne story on the other end of the thing is just, it's been problematic. It's been a bad child. It's it's issued endless challenges to me, and the best efforts of me and others have always come up short and failed to turn it from a story into a case that has evidence, let alone proof. That's what I
Yeah.
hate about it. It's
Eh,
taken a lot of time and effort. We're going to go into some of that today, I would imagine, but it's all up to you.
Yeah. Listen, the first thing I'm going to throw at you is like the fact that I'm unapologetic anymore. I don't really care. Like, this story has got some really weird connections that I think people are going to want to hear about. And we're talking aliens, we're talking ships on the seafloor, we're talking about your dad possibly being involved in this. Like, I'm unpacking a lot right now because people need to know what's going on here. Why is it the case from hell for you? Why is this the UFO case from hell?
Well, some of that's my fault. I mean, in the beginning, you got to remember one of the impetus for getting started in this at all was my first introduction to the Roswell incident, and as I famously said many times, I saw it was a repeat broadcast of the Unsolved Mysteries segment that first dealt with it, that I seen that involved on camera work from Stanton Friedman, Kevin Randall, and the story was really just starting to seep into the public awareness and become known. And I looked at that and I thought, wow, so this wasn't the only place this happened. And of course, I immediately was recollecting, all my foggy memories at that time of Shag Harbour. I was 12. I was in Dartmouth, but I had a family member down there, my maternal grandfather, and I remembered his telling of it and Dad's Navy friends talking about it. And I had a good some kind of recollection. I didn't remember the date, those kind of details. So, but what I thought, what I'd already gleaned from that Unsolved Mysteries episode about Roswell was the fact that, you know what, I'm going to avoid all that mess. I don't want them people arguing about, oh, no, it didn't crash here, it crashed here. I didn't want three sites. I didn't want conflicting testimony. I didn't want wild speculation. And I thought, I'm not going to have to deal with that. I know this case happened and I know where I can find some of the evidence. And next thing I knew, I was out of the blocks. And right from the start, guess what? The very first thing was to rear its ugly head. First of all, here's something. When you watch me, over the years in television documentaries, be they Canadian or U.S. productions, right? Or you see me in an interview in the media, or an article or whatever. It you get the impression that things happen in a certain order. But in the reality is quite different. The very first people I talked to were not the fishermen, were not the local witnesses, were not my own family members that might have remembered some their involvement or knowledge of it. The first thing I did, it was easy for me, was to find the fleet diving unit divers of HMCS Granby. And when I did and talked to them, the very first thing they talked about is they said, "Yeah, Shag Harbour, I was there, yeah." But they all said right from the start, "Well, you know about Shelburne, don't you? That's the real story. This was it." But like Shag Harbour, they couldn't name the date. They didn't remember that. But these are the men that are saying they were there, and it was pretty easy to confirm they were there. I used a reference book in Halifax at the library, Mite City Directory. When these men said this was my job, I could look up and see where he lived. It gave name, rank, not serial number, what their specialty was in the Navy. They were who they said they were. Further to that, their names came to me through the man who had trained them all, that was the head of the fleet diving unit, Guy Fenn Sr. So I knew they were who they were. But right from the start, they're saying, Chris, the real story's off Shelburne.
Okay, so let's just get this clear for the audience. Like, we're talking about two completely different cases. It's just so happens that they're linked together because the proximity is there.
Well,
Maybe.
here's
I mean, I know
well,
what the Shag story is, and the story is that maybe there was some kind of recon mission under the water to help whatever happened in Shag. Now, what's the deal there?
well, Shag Harbour, like I say, is beyond reproach. It's a matter of history. It was a headline story in the Chronicle Herald. Members of the fleet diving unit, ultimately 7 of them, were sent there, in two groups, and they dove and they looked, and people, including RCMP witnesses, said they had seen a 60-foot, at least in one dimension, craft crash into the water, and there was no missing aircraft. All this is true and fascinating that in itself. You know, Ideally, as a UFO researcher, one of the things you're looking for, you look for two things in an ideal world if you're lucky to get these cases. One is you want high strangeness and you want high credibility. Well, the Shag Harbour incident is off the chart in terms of credibility. We have maybe 70 witnesses, 3 RCMP officers, military documents as a result of my search effort in the ensuing years through the 90s, uh, all kinds of testimony. There's no doubt something very unusual happened. The case remains open and unsolved. But all through this, the military types, and not just divers, but them too, some of the brass, some of the support staff from other branches of the forces, you know, told me that, there was also a second search off Shelburne. Now, the question is, when you say, are these joined? Well, certainly the telling of them was joined. But were they joined not just in terms of their two respective nearby locations, or were they together in time or separated? Remember, nobody could name the date. And here's the problem. The Shelburne operation, like you say, I agree, the story promises so much, right? It promises that there's aliens in the water. Some of the same men that were part of the Shag Harbour incident sit there and say, we dove, we shot film, there was still activity in the water, was their expression, right? There were aliens there. There were two UFOs sitting on the seabed off Government Point. One was loaning assistance to the other. Well, it's a fascinating story. That goes way beyond what happens in Shag Harbour, as great as that is. But okay, so where do you find the proof of this? None of these men, when I started demanding, seeking specifics, like, okay, what ship were you on? What did you use as a diving tender? When did it happen? Suddenly, they started getting nervous. Suddenly, they didn't want their name affixed to it. Suddenly, they didn't want to answer those questions. They would remind me that they'd signed a security oath. Well, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. They probably did in such an operation. But I needed the evidence because, you know, again, Shag Harbour is a UFO case. It's beyond reproach. It tells us a lot about our government involvement, the attitude, what happened, how these things are handled. It led to many discoveries in my research, from the Space Object Contingency Plan that shows how we work with other nations and countries, who's in charge, what we do with what we find, all kinds of things that opened up, in terms of UFO research. But this great story promises even more, doesn't it? I mean, that's the promise of it, right?
Yeah,
You got
and
aliens in the water. We got a flotilla of Navy ships above, holding
mhm.
station for over a week. These are all factors in this story. But what ships? When did it happen? Nobody
Yeah,
can
this
say.
is this is
Nobody
where it gets
wants to say.
fascinating. Yes, and we're gonna lead into that because there's some new updated information that no one's heard before. But before we get there, the first question I ever asked you when you told me this end of the story
Hmm.
was that if there's a diver down there shooting footage of what's going on, where is it? Like, where is the film? Did they ever tell you what happened to
Well,
the film?
there is one of the details I did get. They claimed that the film that they shot, and one of the estimates was that it was about 400 feet of film, right? Now, this is film, not video, in the day, under the water, that it was taken and delivered to Dartmouth, to the Defense Research Board on Grove Street in Dartmouth. There's still a facility there to this day. That they drove it up. They even said it was on an old Army Deuce and a Half truck that they used to call Old Sid. I guess that was a real wreck of a thing. Those kind of things. They love to talk shop and give you the details, right? But there's not a logbook for Old Sid.
Hmm.
There should be a log ship for what ships are there, right? So, me being the kind of guy I was, and looking at the kind of effort I put on the Shag Harbour incident, to be honest, at first, in early days when I didn't know what I was doing, I just chose to ignore the story. I didn't throw it out. You can't pick and choose your data. But I looked at it and I said, oh God, do I really want to go there? Do I want to get into this mess that looks as bad as Roswell or worse? That'll be forever controversial and unprovable. But you know what? This story, this Shelburne story that has been the bane of my existence, grew legs. And I wish it would go away, but it wouldn't go away. And it kept surfacing in other ways. And eventually, even some of the evidence about Shag Harbour would prove to be possible evidence, or at least clues, about this Shelburne story that I despise so much. And I'd learned from my mistakes. I certainly made mistakes in the early investigation, but it
Let me
just
ask you
wasn't
this.
going. Yeah.
You say you hate the case, but let's talk about what you've been doing just recently with some applications that you've been filling out. Do you still hate the case, knowing what's potentially going to come
Oh,
back to you here?
I still hate it. You know what? Even if I can ultimately prove, and first of all, it's not a case; it's a story. But if I can make that conversion from story to a
Hmm.
case, and a
Hmm.
case to me, what's the difference? So, look, it's not just semantics. A case is, I can sit there and say, well, this happened. It might still be open to some interpretation. There may be some gaps, but at least you can say, listen, on this date, these men were here, these ships were here, this was the mission, right? And it becomes more than a story. It's a great story if you like stories, and I usually do, but this one has had me running in circles for so long. But yes, I've got efforts going on underway. I hope that'll I've said many times through my involvement with UFOs, which has been since what, 1992 till now. So what? That's almost, my God, it's 30 years. Wow, cool.
Just like that.
Actually, it'll be 30 years in April this year. Now that I think, if you want to get specific, yeah. Anyway, so that's would have been when I saw the rerun of Unsolved.
Yeah.
Anyway, Here's the
So
thing.
can we just talk about the applications that you put in because like this is where it gets weird for me because I usually find that if you dig deep enough in a lot of these UFO cases, there's some who I don't care if anybody thinks I'm woo woo for saying this, but there's often these weird synchronicities involved with some of these cases and the people that are involved. And in this particular case in Shelburne, it looks like your dad possibly could have been involved on some level on one of
It
these
does.
ships during
It
one of these
does.
operations, right?
Yeah. It's hard to say how I feel about that. You know,
Yeah, because here you
Dear
are
old
now
dad
doing what
is
you do.
dear dad has left the planet, so he's not here to defend himself or explain what this or explain it away, whichever. All I can tell you is there was no hint of it from him one way or the other. But I do now and suspect that one of the ships involved in an earlier time frame, by the way, was HMCS Cape Scott, which was a very large Canadian naval warship. It was um, it was in a class of ship we don't have anymore. It was a fleet maintenance ship, which was kind of like something like what Provider and Protector were. It was a supply ship, but it was more than that. They could do major repairs at sea and help other ships. Um, I believe that that was there, and the reason is the identity of some of the chief petty officer and one of the other divers was served on the ship. You see, in the early '60s, I believe this is an early time frame now, separate from Shag Harbour, possibly as early as 1960 or 61. In this case, literally 1960, which would be 7 years earlier. But two of the individuals on there were two that gave testimony on Shag Harbour, and in this mission back then. Um, they were in those days divers were actually assigned to the ship, and this is where they did duty. And ironically, my dad was on the ship and therefore would have been on the mission because he was still on active service on HMCS Cape Scott. He was a medic at the time. And yeah, but I've never heard a word of this from him. Before he passed, I can remember reading my first book there that was co-authored with Don Ledger, and he had no comment on the book or that. And in theory, maybe he could have set me straight, but like so many of these guys, they're willing to take these things to the grave. I don't know. So we'll see in the ensuing months whether he's guilty as charged here or not before I besmirch his good name. But it wouldn't be surprised me that he was another sailor that did his duty and took it with him. The other thing to remember on these missions is somebody like himself may not have known. He may have simply heard the rumors. The only people that really knows know have intimate knowledge of what's going on in these military missions is the brass and the hands-on men. In this case, that would be literally the captain, the XO, perhaps communications men, depending on the nature of communication, right? And the men, that are down there, with the UFO detectors, as they said to me. And I can remember the first time I heard that expression. It was on a different case. That I go, "What's a UFO detector?" Oh, he said, "That's a 16-foot corrugated rusty iron rod with a dirty, sweating man on the other end poking into the ooze, looking for a piece of debris." You know, yeah. Um, and this is what it was like. Of course, the ultimate truth cannot be hidden from these men. If they're down in the water, they can tell the difference between an alien and a Russian diver, no doubt.
Mhm.
So,
So why did the divers, from the HMCS Granby say that they saw aliens? Do you think this guy was full of shit? Because wasn't he supposed to be on sightings, and then he declined at the
oh
last
no,
minute?
no, 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 that wasn't the divers that declined. That was an ELINT officer from the Air Force that was flying
Okay,
grids on an Argus. Yes, that
okay,
was
okay.
and he bowed out, and it was a little surprising because he had a lot to say. He had been for quite a bit of his life a resident of Sandy Point Road, along with his wife,
Mhm.
and he backed out. It's true, and it's a little surprising because he had a short career. He was non-pensionable,
Hmm.
you know, but he made the same mistake, I think, as some of the divers on the purported Shelburne mission and some in Shag Harbour that in the end didn't talk. Is that when I first approached them, some of them said, "Well, get back to me tomorrow. I imagine we can talk about this." And they went down and asked if it was okay with Maritime Command. And that proved to be a big mistake. In the early part of the investigation, Maritime Command had not gone up to Ottawa. It was still in Halifax. They literally walked in and asked, and of course, they were reminded of their duty and their security oaths.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're going to hate me for saying this because there's a lot more like details that, are hardened nuts and bolts kind of stuff that would help prove this case or not. But I'm sure me and everybody else would like to know. I'm a huge Anthony Rosales fan, and he writes books about weird encounters with aliens. Like, what did these divers say they saw? Any descriptions? How many were there? Did he say anything that when you interviewed him?
No, there was no details of the aliens, simply that they were aliens, that there was activity in the water, and they were told to get out right away.
Okay.
Now, this, you know, there are several versions of the story. They're all very similar. All versions agree that a bunch of naval ships, both Canadian and American, held station off Shelburne near this operation for a week. And of course, this is one of the first places I looked for evidence because I thought, okay, we did have a 60 ship Navy then, but I was pretty familiar and knew a number of methods of finding what ships were stationed on the Atlantic side over the years, right? And a great effort was made by me and also by Graham Sims, my co author of Impact to Contact.
Right there. Look.
Yes. And, through this, like we looked at all the um, logbooks for all the possible ships that could have been involved. And we're looking at ships, we're basically looking at DDH, destroyer escorts. We'd already gotten rid of. And now this is based on the assumption that it was simultaneous with Shag Harbour, right? And there's a lot of
Mhm.
clues that suggest it is. I could sit here, we could talk for hours about how many clues suggest it's at the same time, and we could do a second show just about how many clues suggest it's in another time frame. And this is the problem. It's like the old Gordon Lightfoot song, too many clues in this room. There's too many incidents, actual incidents, I'm sure, and other sightings. There's too many things in people's minds over the years. They've joined these together. They've filled it in. And this happens quite a bit. I mean, I can remember, uh, well, why don't we just look at some of the evidence, for example, right now that suggests that maybe it was the same time as the Shag Harbour incident, but I was unable to find evidence. We literally looked, there was one or two that weren't available. Okay, Okay, here's a piece of evidence here. This was one of the first ones I found. What you're looking at is an RCMP HQ 400Q5 form, which was the standard form used in a UFO case. Ironically, there is no such report on Shag Harbour because nobody reported a UFO. There's Mountie Think for you. Um, but this is the form they would have used. And if you look at the top to the right, you can see the number 67 400 23 X. The X at the end makes this an X file. Okay? This wasn't for the public. This is the same day as the Shag Harbour incident, a few hours before, and a ship, the MV Nickerson, is off the coast of Sambro. I forget how far out, 18 miles or whatever. And they're reporting seeing weird lights and four UFOs in the distance. And they're getting radar returns. And they decided to report this to the RCMP. When they came ashore a few days later in Lunenburg, the captain of the boat filled out this. He had 18 men. But here's the thing when I found this, and this was amongst the Burke Gaffney papers, and there was a big procedure for me just to get to see these. They're online now, but at the time, nobody had ever requested to see these papers. When the Jesuit astronomer that started the program in St. Mary's died, he bequeathed these to the university, but nobody'd ever looked at them. I had to go through a procedure. It took 6 months to get permission. I thought it might end up being 400 years because I needed permission from the Catholic Church and two fellow Jesuits who had been left in charge of the will. But here's the corker. When I finally gained access, and that's a whole story in itself. We'll let that go for now. When I read the statement of the witness, Captain Leo Howard Mersey, he says near the end of his words, I had never seen anything like this before. But it looks like the thing that they're looking for down off Shelburne or Barrington Passage. Barrington Passage, he would have meant Shag Harbour. So that would suggest that there were two searches. So I found him and interviewed him. He was elderly, but his mind was still clear. He was living in a special care home at the time in center Nova Scotia near Lunenburg. And he remembered that they were looking two places for UFOs under the water. One was off Shag Harbour, or Barrington Passage, as it's known. They're very close together. And the other was Shelburne. And I said, well, how would he know about Shelburne? Because at the time, or very in the following days, and certainly by that weekend when he fills out the report, the world was hearing of Shag Harbour, but nobody'd heard of Shelburne. It got no press. It got no media whatsoever. So how did he know? He told me the harbor pilot, when he was coming back to Shelburne from the fishing grounds, told him to stay away from the naval operation there. So you put two and two together, you wouldn't have to be Sherlock Holmes to feel safe and jump into the assumption that this is a second search for a UFO, as it says here, as he was told, off Shelburne at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, but again, I went through all the records, the things of the Canadian Navy. Of course, people will say, well, did they falsify those records? I've never found a falsified file for the Canadian Navy yet. And it's hard to do because often they refer to maneuvers with other ships. These all have to coordinate. It's trickier, like one, they might tie up at a dock or transfer staff from another boat. It would take some coordination to do this properly. I've never detected a whiff of it yet. The only place I've ever found a falsified record in Canadian records has been with the Canadian Coast Guard, and that was regarding Shag Harbour. But it was an obvious mistake and falsification. But anyway, yeah. So there's evidence, and I must admit this one impressed me. I'm thinking, well, geez, maybe it did happen. Maybe it did happen at the same time. But and of course, Graham and I and others, Don Ledger tried. I know back in the early days when we did the first book, we did all kinds of things. I literally went up down the road once there at Sandy Point Road, knocking on doors, trying to find residents that had been there long term, trying to find, leaving no stone unturned as to some other way to determine, did Shelburne happen? Is it not just a story? Is it an event? And more importantly, is it simultaneous? I mean, the time frame is so important because I want to find the evidence that makes it not just a story, but a matter of Canadian history, an event.
Okay,
But
let me
there's
ask you
one
a
thing. Yeah,
question.
it strongly suggests simultaneous here, right?
Let me ask you a question here. First of all, just a little self-correction. I meant to say Albert Rosales for all the Rosales fans out there. Sorry. Secondly, if this actually happened and there was a simultaneous search for UFO, why would there even be records? I mean, for something so top secret, would there really be paper trail?
Well, why is it top secret? Why would it be?
A
Shag
UFO
Harbor
search
wasn't.
wouldn't that be? I mean, unless
Shag
they
Harbor,
considered it.
Shag Harbor was not top secret. None of the military records we recovered were ever above unrestricted on Shag Harbor. That's a fact. Like, I didn't have to apply to get them downgraded through the act or anything. They were not restricted. So if we look at that, that isn't automatically the case. Now, I'll tell you what I could argue. Maybe it is the case. Here's the other side of the coin, Justin. Maybe you would expect that, and maybe that is what they would do. Maybe in the case of Shag Harbor, there were so many witnesses and the cat was out of the bag, they had no way to hide it or deny it, so they just simply downplayed it, right? And as
Mhm.
I often remind people, is that Canada in 67 was not New Mexico in 47. You just couldn't simply say, nothing here, go home. Everybody'd seen it. Remember, nobody reported a UFO. People called up thinking there had been a plane crash or lights had gone low. Well, their concerns were for survivors. The initial
Yeah.
coverage of the story was as that. So that made Shag Harbor very, very hard to push aside or to ignore. You had to give some credibility to it. But you know what? I worked on the possibility. Here's one of the things I thought, that for a long time, maybe this played into their hands in Ottawa and somebody did something smart for a change up there. Maybe they looked at Shag Harbor and thought, hey, we know it's no longer there and that it had gotten away. Let everybody look there while they do the search. And everybody did look there and watch the shenanigans going on, watch the divers go down day after day, because they knew that the real action was 25 miles away up the coast off Government
Mhm.
Point. That could
Mhm.
have been. They might have got smart, instead of just saying, no show here, go home. Um,
Yeah. Here, before we keep going here, I want to swing back around. I think we should touch on what you did with this ship search application with Ottawa. But first of all, you mentioned Sandy Point Road there, and I love aliens, man. I know that you came across a story of aliens on Sandy Point Road.
Yeah, this
What's the
this
deal?
this this certainly comes under the heading of too many clues in this room. Well,
Okay.
not even looking for it. I was actually doing laundry in a laundromat in Halifax, and I dropped some papers on the floor. And when the laundry attendant helped pick me up, he says, I remember that. And it was clippings about Shag Harbour. I said, you do? This guy was very young. I said, the hell you do? I mean, were you born? You know? And he said, no, but I knew all the light keepers and whatever. And, I know about the aliens on Sandy Point Road and all this. So I came back the next day to talk to some more because it turned out when I called all the light keepers' names, he was right. And, you know, come back to get some more information, but he was gone. And there was a woman there, and she said, no, I'd fired him. He won't be back. And I thought, what kind of luck? And she said, oh, no, my best friend saw the aliens. And it just come out like this. Now, remember, at this point, I'd not been on television, hadn't written a book, whatever. So I went over to see the friend, and she nearly had a heart attack when I first broached the question to her if she could talk about it. She said she would leave it up to her husband. That they'd left the community and come up here. Her and her friend that initially told me there was a big fight ensued there, and it was problematic. When the husband showed up that day at work, I came back, and he just said, "No, we left town. We're just trying to move on with our lives." And this guy was so they're like, "Wish you all the best. We can't help you." It was just very matter of fact, right? I had found them, they hadn't found me, but you could see the the trauma it caused them just that somebody else knew this. You know, it was a very, very genuine reaction. And, these things leave an impression. I've always considered myself pretty ethical. And when somebody says they can't help and to go away, you ask, you do the best you can, but ultimately, no means no. And I've
Mhm.
had to honor that here. And that was difficult, but you move on. But even if they had told me all the details, oh God, it would have been fascinating. It would have been even a richer story, but it still would have been a story. No single person's that kind of evidence doesn't amount to anything like proof. You know what I mean? We all set our own standard. Mine's pretty high, I'd like to think.
Mhm. So let's talk
Hmm.
about the application process with Ottawa. What are you anticipating
Well,
is going to come from
that's
that?
ongoing. That's ongoing. That's going to take some time to play out in this time of COVID. That's a barrier. The other barrier, Justin, is that there's a procedure here. I ultimately expect that the ship's file I have requested, there will ultimately be a number more, but I'm looking for some indications on this of other ships present. There's a second time frame I can look at where I know of several ships, but we're going to let this one play out. It's the most likely. But um, it, they claim to hold the file I have. I found it in the finder's aids. It's a time before they send an investigator down to pull it out and send it to me. But it could be reviewed, often is the case in these military logs, when uh, often they're concerned about when it shows the relationship between Canada and other nations on these matters. And that will be
Mhm.
the case here since it involves a NATO mission that was redeployed. So, we'll do a follow up to this deep dive with one, and hopefully it's a happy story or happier story. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
because we're talking about
um,
3 different potential dates for this thing happening. We're talking about in
four
October,
actually
67
now.
4, okay, and we got
I've
60, we
I've
got
found
61, and
another
this okay. What's the 4th one?
60. Well, we have October 1960, which is pretty much exactly 7 years before Shag. We have March 61 as another
Mhm,
mission. There's one that I know involved at least 4 Canadian warships off Shelburne. We have another one that could be one of 3 years that uh, in the month of December, and we don't know if it's 60, 61, or 62. Remember, these guys don't write down notes and take this home. You know what I mean? They're
mhm,
reminded all the time of their duty, loose lips, sink ships, and all that kind of stuff, right? Um, so yeah, no, pardon me, it's three. Yeah, so there's three possibilities right now, that have to play out. And the first one, I'm hoping is the most likely and the most promising, because we actually do know from testimony of men on the ship and articles I found about it that it was literally off Shelburne and that it involved like ships from Canada, the U.S., and NATO.
Hmm.
and was probably a redeployed NATO exercise. But,
Hmm.
again, once I get the ship's logs and we see was it there, did this whole station a week, that's a part of the story. But
Yeah.
here
So other than people's personal testimony, all we have is that one X file, really, right? That says that something
no,
happened.
no, we have more than that. Let's show you
Okay,
another one right now.
let's
We
do it.
have once our producer here can buzz it up for us here, we have the handwritten notes of the late Father Michael Burke Gaffney, and I'll tell you how that fits the story. Um,
Perfect.
Remember that in the Shelburne story, one of the features about it, and it'll be a marker. Here we are here. Boy, he had poor penmanship. I mean, beyond being an astronomer and a real estate salesman and a Jesuit priest, this guy could have been a doctor writing scripts. And you can see how the handwriting it must have sped up, or he's getting impatient or something deteriorates as you go down. This is the actual handwriting of astronomer Burke Gaffney. And what this is about, if you look at the
Mhm.
top, there's a date, October the 12th, 67. This
Mhm.
is 1025. So think about this. This is like 1 week later after the Shag Harbour incident to the hour.
Mhm.
And what this is this is handwritten notes by him that I found in his archival boxes. And the Mounties have called him. He's got it looks like Stockler, but it was actually Stoliker, an RCMP corporal calling from headquarters on Oxford Street in
Yeah.
Halifax, calling him to give him details. Because there's also two X files that show a complaint by him to the station. Now, in the newspapers at the time, in the Herald, he was saying because of the coverage of Shag Harbour, forget about UFOs. He had no interest in them whatsoever. But the two previous X files of this are letters that actually chastise him for not getting UFO reports to him quick enough. So
Hmm.
let
Interesting.
that be. But when you look at this in the poor penmanship, one of the things back in the day with Don Ledger, and like many like TV producers, like one of the producers of this show, and I'll talk about that a little later.
Yeah.
Um, they often they like the Shelburne story, right? And they want to roll it into you know uh, the Shag Harbor incident, because like Don often felt, and I get this, I can understand the desire for it, that this is the meat and potatoes of the case. Well, if you look
Depends on
down
what you're
here,
looking for. Are you looking for a legitimized UFO event, or are you looking for a larger, search and rescue sort of situation here? Like, there's
I want
two
I want
different
what's
things to be
real.
looking
I'm
for.
only interested in what really happened myself.
Exactly.
I
Let me ask you a
I'm
question about this document, though, Chris. Like, how do we know this
Yeah,
just isn't some handwritten copy from some schlub out on the street? Like, how did you get it? How can you verify that it came from him?
because I was the first person to enter these files that got permission. Nowadays they're open and many of them are online from St. Mary's University about these preserved papers of Father Michael Burke Gaffney. But it took me 6 months and I had to meet with two Jesuits, Father William Lonk and William Breggio, to get permission. Nobody'd ever asked or gone into them. There were 26 standard archival boxes of paper he'd bequeathed to the university, unpublished manuscripts, personal papers, business dealings. Box one of those 26, the first box was nothing but UFO reports and a
Wow.
lot of Mountie reports like this. And this is where I found the stuff about Shag Harbor. But this is 1 week later, and this is about what's become known as the Cameron sighting, again in Shag Harbor. And think about how this fits the Shelburne story, because here's another feature we haven't mentioned yet. In the Shelburne story, these ships supposedly off Shelburne sat over these things for a week holding station. And after the week, they
Mhm.
move under the water back to the Gulf of Maine, break the surface, and fly away. And here, this is what he's writing down as the two sets of lights were seen at this time coming up out of the water and flying away. So again, this is a document that's often been used to suggest that this was at the same time, or at least 1 week later than Shag Harbor, not earlier in the 60s, right? One of
Mhm.
the other things is with the bad writing in this. When you look down where it looks like it says one point, like here, like off government point, or like he's abbreviated government point, as people sometimes do. I actually believe that says off Garen's Point, which is Maggie Garen's Point in Shag Harbor, and that
Hmm.
this is not notes about what was seen in Shelburne, you know. But still, it shows the interest he had. Interestingly, at the bottom of this report, back row radar negative. But yeah, I was first to be allowed in. When I was given permission, I had to go in a room and do it. And put them back the way they are and seal them. Even the archivist wasn't allowed to see them at the time, Wendy Bullerwell. It was
Hmm.
a real procedure. I mean, when I think about it, it's so much silliness, and now they're online. Eventually, see, in the end, what happened is we had the will reread, and there was no encumbrances to release, and it's an open file now. But
Okay.
again, this is another piece of evidence that would suggest it's at the same time.
All right. Well, let's talk about, do we have another document we can see?
Well, we have. I have some. I have two pages from something I published in '96 that suggests that Shelburne is nothing but a story.
Hmm.
And I can tell you one of the reasons why it's become so tangled into the thing. I mean, when I was told of it, I wasn't big to promote it. Yes, it did end up in the book. I've always been clear to state that the Shelburne story is just that, a story. And again, if our producer can show up, we have a couple pages here. I don't know if he's going to show them one at a time or they'll both come up.
It's so
My
strange that there's 4 different times for this specific, well, who knows if this is a real event, but I mean, it's, don't you think it's a little bit weird that we have so many different time frames for
Well, I
something?
could tell you this, that in the beginning, I couldn't have told you when Shag Harbour was. If I had to guess, I would have said the late 60s. I didn't remember the date. Neither did Lori Wickens or any, you know what I mean? We had to go looking for it. I mean, right now,
Mhm.
it'll pop
Okay.
up with a Google search. That wasn't the case at the time, right? What you're looking
So what
at
are we
here,
looking at here with this?
this is the first thing I published about Shag Harbour. And what it was, I was invited down to the U.S. to, where was this one? Greensboro, North Carolina. This is, as it says at the top, the symposium proceedings from that year. This is the 1996 edition. I was
Mhm.
invited. I was one of the keynote speakers, and I spoke about Shag Harbour. This paper, if we looked at the title page, which we don't have here today, this article was called Shag Harbour in Perspective. Again, this is July 1996. And if you look at the page that's showing halfway down, you see the word the story. And this is the beginning of me recounting the Shelburne story. And if we go to the next document, you'll see what I conclude at the end of it. And at the end of it, it says, where is it if it's big enough? Can I make that bigger? Oh, look, I can. Cool. Uh, okay. Above where it says the documents, the story remains for now just that, a story. Such may not always be the case. Well, in my books, it's still a story. I'm still trying to raise it above that. I'm open to it because it won't go away. It keeps coming back to haunt me, to torment me. And, you know, I've either got to do it. I'm hoping that this latest effort will raise it to a case, something with some evidence that says it happened here and it happened then, and here's who was involved, and here's what they thought about it. And when you think about it, that's what we have from the Shag Harbour incident. And I either want to do that, but I'll tell you, if it doesn't pan out this time, although I've said this a dozen times in my life, I'm done with it. But when that chance comes back, because nobody else seems to go out and do it or do the work, the footwork. So
Yeah.
hopefully
Yeah.
we'll see that a follow up deep dive issue on this will give us the goods. But that's how I felt
Let's
about it.
talk
But
about,
TV producers, including one of the producers of this show, Michael McDonald, um, when it was presented to them about the evidence, and they thought, my God, I'm going to do a UFO documentary. And Michael was the first one to do a feature documentary about the Shag Harbour incident. He included the Shelburne evidence as it was one and same in the story. Now,
Mhm.
in fairness to Michael, I couldn't tell him, no, that's wrong, you can't do that. I was dubious of it. You can see my words in '96 when he put that one out, and I think it was in 2001 it came out, or somewhere around there. You know what I mean? Like, I couldn't say it wasn't. I wasn't happy about it. Don Ledger spoke that it probably was. It's been difficult. It's been whatever. I get why they do this. From they're making television. There is some evidence. It's there. This is a story that's told. But I think it stands alone. I think it's elsewhere in time. We'll know in the I'm hoping we'll know in the months. It torments me, you know. But yeah, people want, it's like Stanton Friedman says, Chris, you got to sizzle. Well, people want to sizzle. I like to sizzle. I like to put things in their strongest light. But to me, this is still a story. I want it to either get better or I want it to go away. But, right now, it's stuck in the middle, Justin.
okay. Well, I've got geodesic markers written down here. What's the
Oh,
story on that?
Well, this I think says something about the Shelburne story indirectly here. In 2000, was it 17? Let me think. Yeah, my God, the years go by. 2017. Um, a U.S. Navy geodesic marker was found on Bon Portage Island, and it was found very near the spot where the former lightkeeper Irvin Banks claimed to find an artifact the next morning after the Shag Harbour incident.
Hmm.
And he recovered this, and he claimed that he packaged this up and called for instructions from the Canadian Coast Guard, which was his boss. There's a photo of it there now. And that marks the spot where he'd found an artifact. Now, what he found was a tube with strange wires and something like fiber optics hanging out of it, had an unusual smell. And he packed it up the way they told him to, and it was handed over to the U.S. Navy. Now, this was not what was supposed to happen under the master plan, or what's known as the Space Object Contingency Plan. This should have been surrendered to Canadian Armed Forces, being found there. This does not happen. I know that in Ottawa they were unaware of the find of this artifact, and it should not have been turned over to American forces, but it was. All
Hmm.
those years later, in fact, 50 years later, we found this down in the grass there at that spot. Since then, we've also found Mrs. Isabel Tower, the
Hmm.
ex wife of the lighthouse keeper, and she confirms the story that he did find us. In fact, it was interesting. She wouldn't let them bring it in the house, whatever we'd found, but she did agree that it was packed up and taken over to the wharf and sent to the mainland for retrieval from a naval officer from Norfolk. You know, yes. When I looked up the code on this thing, there's a book that gives suggestions of what these codes mean there. The
Hmm.
what's scratched into this one and there means that an article of extreme interest was found on this spot. So if the U.S. Navy was in and breaking the rules in '67 with Shag Harbour, I'm sure they had no reason to tell Ottawa what they were up to off the coast, although there were Canadian warships around. And I know that Squadron Leader William Bain, in charge of the air desk, which was in charge of UFO investigations at the time, knew nothing of the Shelburne story. But he had suggested to me perhaps we were stick handled by the Americans.
Hmm. Well, let's just say we're not talking about UFOs and this marker was dropped. What would be there if the story of UFOs weren't connected? If
Well,
it's
there
of
should be
high interest,
something
what would that mean? A
there should be
nuke?
something quite unusual. Well, yes, it could be that, and I've heard stories that before these bases became shared, that when they were American staff only, up to 62, and this
Mhm.
would be the base Canadian Forces Station Shelburne, and also Canadian Forces Station Barrington and Backrow, the radar facility. That in the old days when there was just now. I've been told again we don't have the evidence by several staff there that they stored some specials there, and by specials they meant old hydrogen warheads and that. Yeah, nukes. So,
And for
but
the audience out there, back row really is just not far from where we had our tremendous 2018 UFO sighting.
yeah, it's automated now. It's that end of the pine tree line. Everybody's familiar in movies hearing about the dew line up north,
Mhm.
but there's two other sets of NORAD radar that crisscross North America. You have the dew line on the far north, you have the mid Canada line, and then you have the pine tree line. And the back row base is this end of the pine tree line.
Okay, Chris, there's only about 15 minutes left with us here today. Like, what do you really want to hit home here and hammer to the listeners in the audience about the Shelburne case? Is it that you want to make a clear distinction between Shag Harbor and Shelburne, or what?
Well, if it turns out that I'm right with my latest effort to turn it from a story into a case, come
Mhm.
up with some documentary evidence, some ship's logs that would back it up. If that's the case, then the stories are separate, because it'll be in an earlier time frame. But I think there were other sightings and other incidents going on then. They may not have involved a flotilla of Navy ships. There may have been two searches in. There were searches up and down the coast at other sightings points, right? You got to
Mhm.
remember that October 67, many UFO researchers here in Canada call it the night of the UFOs. There were so many incidents, right? And the
That's right.
trouble is with the plasticity of memory in humans and everything else, it's all become slurred. And when I
Mhm.
first spoke to these divers, here's the other thing. Here's the other side of the argument. Before it got rolled into one, I must admit that the very first diver I spoke to, like everybody else, he did not remember the date, but he said 67. And he was one of several that said, you know, uh, the real story's off Shelburne. When I said, yeah, October 67 was when Shag Harbour happened, then he was like, no, I thought it was closer to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which would be
Mhm.
October 62.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. And then the other thing is the ship that I'm looking at now would involve two of the men that did talk, and they were both stationed on that ship. So there are
Mhm.
things that suggest it was an earlier time frame. Um, and think about how that would make it easier for them to hide, because the Shelburne base at the time, where supposedly aliens are less than a mile away under the water, if that's the case. And you got to remember its function too. Not only is it nearby, it's the coordination center for submarine detection for the whole Atlantic Ocean. The SOSA system or sound system and the MAD grid all came ashore there. And that base was connected by a hard link to our Gentian, Newfoundland, and Key West, Florida. You know,
Yeah.
it was a very important base, and at the time it was U.S. only. So they could have controlled the information flow to Ottawa. In fact, they probably had very little information flowing between that base and Ottawa in 1960, 61, and 62. It was
Mhm.
only after then it became a 50-50 operation under a NORAD arrangement, where it would alternate COs and staff, right?
Mhm. And being
So,
the other side of the coin on this show, like you and I both know that that particular area does seem to be an area of high strangeness with a lot of weird cases. And if
well,
there was a presence there, I mean, that would also give reason for multiple, uh, investigations by some of these other groups stationed at these military installations. Who knows?
yeah,
I mean, I'm
yeah.
speculating, obviously, but I'm just saying, should
Yeah,
keep
I
that
mean, you
in
got to
mind.
remember the Shelburne base always operated under a cover story while it was open, and it was only because of a sex scandal in the late '80s that its true function became revealed. You know, they used to claim it was an oceanographic military research station. But in actual fact, it was the coordination center for submarine detection for the whole Atlantic Ocean. That's what it was, and it was only because of five women who were dismissed. They were considered a security risk because they lived a promiscuous lesbian lifestyle. At
Mhm.
that time, unfortunately, gay people in the military here had no rights, right? And they were just drummed out unceremoniously, with a dishonorable discharge, right? But
Yeah.
the result of that, and people, I think it was Dan Middlemiss, I think, of Dalhousie, uh, a defense consultant, that when he looked into the incident, it revealed the true nature of the base. Of course, people in the community knew it. There were rumors, but they officially admitted to and blew their cover story then. Um, Less than 10 years later, the base was shut down and defunct, and all the data that Canada has now comes ashore and goes directly in Halifax to Maryland Center, just about down under the McDonald Bridge there almost.
Mhm. Yeah.
Hmm.
There are people out there too that, like, will make connections between UFOs and military installations. I was one too until I realized, like, in the United States, there's hundreds of installations
They're
all over the
everywhere.
country. So you could
Yeah.
make a claim that, a really loose claim that UFOs are showing up over military installations, but they're everywhere.
They're
So,
everywhere. I mean, think
yeah.
about it. Shelburne County had two U.S. bases.
Wow.
Shelburne County, Nova
Little
Scotia.
tiny place here for all the
Yeah,
listeners, a little tiny place in this
yeah.
province that you never even see or hear of in your lifetime if you're
And
lucky.
and the Shelburne base was Canada's most secretive base for sure. You know,
Wow.
I mean, even people told me. Think about another case here that we've referred to on some of our episodes. I mean, when you look at the Webster sighting in Lower Sackville, remember the gentleman there, one of them that gave testimony. He was a naval architect and had designed some of the buildings at Shelburne. But
Mhm.
when he would walk through the rooms where the scopes were and that, they would get staff to hold up a sheet so he couldn't see what they were seeing when he walked through the room, like he'd never seen such security, right?
Mm.
And I had that experience. I entered the base once shortly before it was shut down and walked through, and they were still doing that then. However, in Maryland Center in Halifax, before the Jeffrey Delisle scandal, I don't think you would now. You could come in and get tours, and they would show you, and it was fascinating. And you had some real sense of the capability and how good it was. Like they could look at the big scrolling thermal paper, and you could ask one of the girl plotters, and she would say, I'd say, what's those squiggles there? And they would say, oh, well, that's a group of right whales 100 miles out or something. They showed
Yeah.
that to Michael McDonald, our producer, once when he strolled through it, but it was open. But since the Jeffrey Delisle case, that's, it's no longer open to the public.
Well, this has been super insightful for me because, obviously the books and the data just wasn't there to really hash out a real good case for Shelburne, but
Well,
it sounds like we're heading in that direction. If all things go well, then we may have some data that'll prove one way or
yeah,
the other.
I'm trying not to get too excited. I've
Yeah.
been there. I've had this promise broke so many times. It's um, But look, if I had to boil it down to a slogan like they like to do in union, and where you have that short interview, a guy jabs a mic in front of you and says, "Well, are these the same, or what's the difference between Shag Harbour and Shelburne?" If I got two sentences, I tend to say, "Well, Shag Harbour is the gift that keeps on giving, and the Shelburne story is a problem child. Just refuses to go away, refuses to be disciplined, but I wish they would disappear." But here I find myself once again trying to either breathe life into his nostrils or damn it to hell, whichever. But it
Mhm.
torments me, because every time, I mean, so many things have gone bunko. I mean, we could sit there and talk all day whether it was the testimony of somebody I proved worked on the basis a civilian through this and didn't have that extra loyalty, or whether it was a story that appeared in the Vancouver Courier from a U.S. person that wrote in and said the USS Vermilion was part of this and sat there. But then when I got one of my friends, and hoping a future guest on the show there with the Fund for UFO Research, to write down, and he secured the records from the USS Vermilion from these time frames, and it was never there.
Mm.
So it's
Interesting.
always been frustrating. I'm tied up in knots, but maybe I'll throw a party, but I'll just go, yay, thank God, the relief. Because you know what? You know what happens if this log pans out and we find that Shelburne was an actual incident back then? The work just begins. I got other
All over
ships to
again for
find,
Chris
got an appeal
Giles.
for stuff. It's Shag Harbor all over again and more, right?
That's
So why
exciting.
do we do it? I don't know.
I don't think I was very aggressive at all this time around, Chris. But I'm glad I had the opportunity because I know there's these weird little details with this case: the aliens,
Yeah.
the second site, the
What
possible
bothers me
connection
is the
to death.
weird details people have tried to add. I see these comments there when it comes up about underground tunnels, and I don't know anything about any
Oh
tunnels.
wow, that's a new
I
one for
never
me.
heard about it. Well, no, it's new to me too. I don't know anything about it. Um, there's the
Uh,
music. Yeah.
I actually do remember
No,
this
you
story,
were.
and I know who it came from too. But
Oh,
that's
there you
another
go.
story.
For another day. Hopefully,
Well,
this
thanks,
one is a
Chris.
happy ending, and we'll do round two like down the road. I'm hoping. I'm hoping it's worth
I
the
can't wait.
stamps. I'm
I
hoping
can't
it's
wait,
worth.
man.
Yeah, I'm hoping it's worth the cost of the copies from Ottawa once again, if any.
Well,
Yeah.
all
Yeah,
right,
that was
man. Well,
pretty
thanks a lot.
painless. Thank you. Pretty painless.
Yes. Hey, everybody out there, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment to SFUFO. We're known as FSUFO Cast on Instagram and Twitter. Check us out on YouTube as well for all the latest content.